Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we are going to look at 3 of the most unsettling events that could possibly occur deep underwater. You'll understand what I mean shortly, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. Located in Southern Belgium, the Plate-Taille reservoir has long attracted divers. When the dam was constructed, rising water levels submerged and hid numerous old structures, creating a haunting yet captivating underwater world for divers to explore. On the evening of January 4, 2024, 2 experienced divers, 46-year-old Christophe and 59-year-old Frédéric, arrived at the site with all their gear neatly packed in their vehicle. The weather wasn't ideal that day. The sky was cloudy and recent rain had left the water cloudy as well. But neither diver was deterred. Both men were seasoned professionals, well prepared for the demands of diving in low visibility and deep water conditions. This dive, their first of the new year, was a way to shake off the winter quiet and reconnect with the silence beneath the surface. To them, it probably seemed like just another ordinary dive. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a familiar underwater sight they'd seen many times before. Equipped with rebreathers, dive propulsion vehicles, and years of experience, they were confident. But that night would prove anything but ordinary. The Plate-Taille reservoir is actually part of a system of 5 linked reservoirs and holds the title of Belgium's largest artificial lake. Spanning 865 acres, it is surrounded by thick woods and gentle hills. For divers, the lake has always had a unique appeal. Its depth, submerged ruins, and naturally murky waters make for both a difficult and rewarding dive. Because of this, it became a go-to training location for local dive clubs. Strict regulations were in place, and diving was only allowed in a specific area managed by one such club. Beyond that controlled zone, dangers increased substantially. At the center of the lake is the Plate-Taille Dam, a colossal construction that transformed the region when it was completed in the 1970s. Measuring 2,592 feet, or 790 meters in length, it is Belgium's largest dam, a formidable concrete structure supporting a pumped storage hydroelectric power plant. Beneath the surface, however, the dam hides something far more dangerous. A network of intake tunnels runs deep, about 50 to 70 meters, drawing water into the dam's turbine system. These hidden channels act like arteries for the power station, pulling in water with immense force before sending it through the turbines. When the dam was operational, the suction was tremendously strong, powerful enough to pull in anything that got too close. Regular divers at the lake were fully aware of this threat. In fact, when the turbines were active, the low, constant hum of machinery could be heard reverberating through the water, a distant but unmistakable warning of the deadly currents below. Thankfully, most divers kept to depths within 20 meters of the surface, far above the dangerous zone. But those who dove deeper, especially near the dam, risked encountering a force no diver could fight or escape. As evening fell over the Plate-Taille reservoir, the 2 divers completed their equipment checks. Around 5 p.m., they entered the water, gliding below the surface with the help of their dive propulsion vehicles. The water was cold and murky, limiting visibility to just a few feet. But again, these were not unfamiliar conditions for the experienced pair. It's likely they had mapped out their dive route ahead of time, relying on their training, tools, and instincts to navigate. Everything initially went according to plan. But at some point, they drifted off course. Instead of remaining in the authorized diving area, they unintentionally moved closer to the dam's intake tunnels. Local divers knew the unspoken rule: never approach the intake zone when the turbines are running. Yet that night, whether because of the low visibility, the hum of their own propulsion vehicles, or a simple misjudgment, Christophe and Frédéric crossed an unseen boundary. Suddenly, the water's pull shifted, from gentle to abrupt and overwhelming. They lost control. The suction from the intake tunnel, powered by the turbines, was too powerful to resist. In mere seconds, they were no longer recreational divers. They were victims caught in a relentless current being pulled toward a massive mechanical system built to push millions of gallons of water. By the time they realized what was happening, it was far too late to escape. The first indication that something was wrong came several hours after the dive should have ended. Frédéric's son, growing increasingly uneasy when his father failed to return or make contact, drove to the reservoir. There, he found their vehicle still parked and untouched. It was already nightfall, and there was no trace of Christophe or Frédéric. At first, hope lingered. Maybe they had simply lost track of time. But as the minutes turned into hours, that hope gave way to fear. A call for help was made, and within hours, a full-scale search operation was underway. By the next day, a team of 10 professional divers equipped with sonar equipment began scouring the waters. A helicopter with a thermal imaging camera also flew overhead, searching for any signs of movement. But the conditions were incredibly poor. Recent heavy rains had stirred up mud and debris, making underwater visibility almost non-existent. Surface currents were rough, and deeper currents were even worse. Even the expert recovery divers found it difficult to fight against the water's pull. But on the night of January 5th, more than 24 hours after the divers went under, the search team made their first breakthrough. Pieces of diving equipment were found scattered in the reservoir: a vest, oxygen tanks, and other items. These should have remained fastened to the divers. The fact that they were found loose suggested something violent and devastating had occurred. By the next morning, search efforts narrowed to a specific area, downstream of the dam near the turbines. If Christophe and Frédéric had been sucked into the turbine system, any remains would likely be discovered beyond that point. And then, at 12:30 p.m. on January 6th, the divers made their final and tragic discovery near the dam's core area. In June of 2002, Chris Lemons never thought of himself as someone exceptional. Born and raised in Edinburgh, he viewed himself as just an ordinary person, only with a somewhat unusual job. Years earlier, at the age of 19, he had felt directionless and unsure about his future. Life seemed to be drifting until an unexpected opportunity came his way when the father of a friend offered him a job on a diving vessel. At first, Chris saw it merely as a temporary summer job, something to earn money while he figured out what he truly wanted to do in life. But that seemingly minor decision ended up changing the course of his entire life. It was on that first vessel where Chris was introduced to the unique and rarely discussed field of saturation diving. This topic has been covered before on this channel, but since it's been a while, here's a brief refresher. Saturation divers live and work at extreme underwater depths, typically on oil rigs or deep-sea cable installations. These depths are so intense that divers require carefully calibrated gas mixtures to avoid dangerous medical complications. Chris found this risky but fascinating profession completely captivating. Saturation diving wasn't something Chris had originally set out to do. However, after learning more about it and seeing the respect saturation divers commanded among other crew members, he became intrigued. He completed rigorous training, earned all the necessary certifications, and soon found himself spending weeks at a time living in pressurized chambers aboard ships. From there, he would descend hundreds of feet beneath the sea in small metal chambers called dive bells. Over time, entering those bells felt as routine as heading into the office for a day's work. He came to feel unexpectedly at home in those tight, pressurized environments, always tethered to the surface by an umbilical cable that delivered air, warmth, communication, and a lifeline back to safety. Eventually, Chris joined the crew of the Baby Topaz, a ship operated by 120 people and stationed roughly 100 kilometers northeast of Aberdeen, servicing oil rigs in the North Sea. There, he regularly faced unforgiving conditions, brutal winds, towering waves on the surface, and complete darkness below. On September 18, 2012, Chris and fellow divers David and Duncan prepared for what appeared to be just another standard dive at the Huntington oil field. Duncan, the most experienced among them and a mentor to Chris, stayed inside the dive bell while Chris and Dave exited and descended nearly 300 feet, 91 meters, to perform maintenance on a subsea manifold, a large yellow oil industry structure roughly the size of a house. Despite winds gusting at 35 knots and ocean swells reaching 18 feet, 5.5 meters, such conditions were considered normal for the North Sea. At the depths where Chris and Dave were working, the water remained calm and still. Chris even noticed how surprisingly good the visibility was that day. For about an hour, the dive went smoothly. They worked efficiently under the dive bell, which remained clearly visible above them. But then, through their helmet speakers, a blaring alarm interrupted their task. While such alarms weren't unusual due to routine testing, the immediate urgency in the dive supervisor's voice was alarming. "Leave everything there. Get out of the structure, boys," came the command. Chris and Dave responded instantly, abandoning their equipment and heading for the dive bell hovering just above. But when they reached the surface of the structure, they were met with a terrifying sight. The dive bell had vanished. Unknown to them, the ship's dynamic positioning system had suffered a catastrophic failure. This caused the topaz to drift uncontrollably, dragging the dive bell along with it. Chris and Dave were now stranded nearly 300 feet underwater in the blackness of the North Sea. Chris's heart pounded as he absorbed the horrifying situation. In the next instant, with the dive bell being pulled away, his umbilical cable went taut. Moments later, it snapped against the sharp metal edge of the manifold. Chris was being dragged, trapped between the 8,000-ton drifting ship and the massive metal structure. He realized he was the physical anchor holding the ship back. He thrashed in the water, desperately trying to free himself, knowing he might be pulled through the narrow slits of the manifold, something akin to being forced through a giant underwater cheese grater. Then, just as suddenly as the pulling started, it stopped. Momentarily freed from that danger, Chris knew his life was still in peril. Dave, still struggling, was being dragged away by his own umbilical and could only watch helplessly as Chris slipped out of view. Then came the final blow. Chris's umbilical snapped with a sharp crack, like a gunshot underwater. In an instant, he plummeted to the ocean floor, landing at a depth of 100 meters, 330 feet, now in complete darkness, with water temperatures hovering at 3°C-37 degrees, and no air supply from the surface. Saturation divers are equipped with a backup gas tank that connects to their helmet, intended for emergencies. Amid the chaos, Chris managed to flip the switch and activate it. But in a panic, that backup air supply would only last around 9 minutes if he was lucky. Disoriented, Chris fought to gather his bearings. Feeling through the pitch-black water, he stumbled into the manifold and clung to it as his only hope. He looked up, hoping to see signs of rescue, but there was nothing, just blackness. Time passed, and his thoughts turned to the people he loved, especially his fiancée. They had been planning their wedding for the following year and building a home together. Now, he realized he would never get to see any of that come to life. The grief deepened as he thought about the pain his death would cause. His breathing slowed, his mind began to fade, and he finally accepted what seemed inevitable. Above, on the topaz, the crew worked frantically to regain control of the ship. Though they believed Chris was already gone, they still launched a massive rescue effort. Incredibly, the ship's positioning system came back online, allowing them to return to the dive site. Inside the dive bell, Duncan waited anxiously. When Dave re-entered, they spoke briefly before Dave volunteered to dive again, assuming he'd be recovering a body. As the dive bell descended and Dave entered the water, he steeled himself for what he was about to find. Thankfully, it only took a few minutes to locate the manifold, and atop it, he found Chris's body. He pulled him toward the dive bell, preparing for the worst. But once inside, Duncan quickly removed Chris's helmet and was shocked by his ghostly blue face. He instinctively gave 2 rescue breaths, and to everyone's astonishment, Chris gasped, coughed, and came back to life. The 2 men stared in disbelief. Chris had survived 35 minutes without access to breathable air on the ocean floor. Just minutes later, all 3 divers were safely back in a pressurized chamber aboard the Topaz. Chris's survival stunned medical experts. How he suffered no brain damage or permanent injury remains a mystery. Chris later speculated that the frigid ocean temperatures might have slowed his body functions enough to protect his organs, and the oxygen-rich gas he had been breathing before the accident may have helped preserve his tissues. He spoke with experts around the world and attended medical conferences, but the exact reason for his survival remains unclear. Miraculously, Chris returned to diving just 3 weeks later. He married his fiancée soon after, and although they are no longer together, they had 2 children whom Chris now devotes his life to raising. In 2019, his incredible story was turned into a feature-length documentary called The Last Breath, which includes real footage, interviews, and dramatic recreations of the event. To this day, Chris continues to work in some of the world's most intense and dangerous underwater environments. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. If you have a story idea, feel free to submit it using the link in the description. You can also listen to the audio version of these stories on any podcast platform. And if you'd like to support the channel, consider joining Patreon or becoming a member here on YouTube. Thanks again, and I hope to see you in the next video.